Bong Joon-ho's latest film having a through line of classism in the age of late-stage capitalism was predictable and welcome, especially following Parasite. The subject is one clearly close to the director's heart and has informed some truly sadistic humor and tragic human drama presented through the momentum of a rapidly developing and escalating plot. So even if Mickey 17 just wound up being Parasite but in space this time, it would merit excitement. What we get instead is something of a blend, with the film also borrowing visually and thematically from Snowpiercer and Okja to set the scene of a cult travelling in a space freighter to settle on a distant planet. While the core concept revolves around Robert Pattinson's Mickey, a meek drone worker who volunteered himself to be a guinea pig for human experimentation, and to be revived in a new clone body every time said experiments prove lethal, suddenly finding himself face to face with a duplicate, cloned and installed with all of his memories for the 18th time before 17 has had a chance to die first. This, by itself, really had all the makings of a compelling film. The first encounter between the two duplicates and the race to kill one so the other can live, as teased in the trailer, really felt like it would be Mickey 17's discovering the bunker moment. Perhaps happening a little earlier here than it did in Parasite, but nevertheless triggering a similar plot freight train that takes the characters' journeys and thematic exploration to truly uncharted territories. Surprisingly though, following some entertaining back and forth between the two Pattinsons, as well as Naomi Aki's Nasha and Anna Maria Bartolome's Kai, as the Mickeys try to kill each other and Nasha and Kai consider the sexual parameters of cloned duplicates, Mickey's personal journey gets a little lost in the shuffle of the grander plot of the colonization scheme spearheaded by the Marshalls, played by Mark Ruffalo and Toni Collette, the rights of an indigenous species discovered on the planet they plan to colonize, and the resurgence of a plot to kill Mickey by the mob boss he fled from on Earth. All of these feel unexpectedly disconnected from Mickey's own journey. Unexpectedly, because Bong Joon-ho has proven how capable he is of having the most complex plot threads branch out from a deceptively simple setup, the result of which is that all ensuing chaos feels firmly rooted in a specific point of focus. And Pattinson, bolstered by the aforementioned brilliant supporting cast, is an absolutely captivating anchor, with what we get of his duplicate story easily the most compelling stuff in the film. The ethics are provoking enough at the start, as the narration implies a familiar enough concept to us. The notion that each Mickey, treated like a disposable lab rat, is an individual whose life does not carry on in the new clone body, but dies as permanent a death as the body he inhabits, reinforced by Nash's suggestion that each new Mickey feels a little different to her from the last. Things escalate wonderfully when 17 and 18 share the screen, offering a reversal that implies that Mickey's soul truly has carried over from body to body, and the presence of two Mickeys has in fact divided the one soul up into two vessels, with 18 representing the id and or ego to 17's superego. Forgive this psychology layman's likely oversimplification. This clash and coming together of shared persona really should be the direct centerpiece of all the surrounding drama involving the ship, the power dynamics within, the planet and its inhabitants. It had the makings of a Brazil-level black tragic comedy, on the reduction of our individuality in a world dominated by the power-mad industrialists and colonizers. Instead, Mickey's predicament is mostly used as shorthand for his character development, personifying what would usually be an internal struggle with his personal demons to become a more fully realized version of himself. While his unique predicament does land him in the center of all the other story threads in the film, you get the vibe that almost everything that happens would have happened even if the duplicate story had been cut. There's nothing especially wrong with the other parts of Mickey 17 feeling familiar. Nothing feels phoned in, especially Ruffalo and Collette, who are clearly enjoying their chance to act as gluttonously wretched as they please. But the predictable procedure and outcome of the imbalance of power aboard the ship and the misunderstood conflict with the natives feels more glaring precisely because there's something far more interesting crammed into the middle of all that, vying for our attention before being mostly dismissed. Danny Dyer isn't someone I've paid a great deal of attention to since his feature debut performance in Human Traffic, although connecting that character to this one in Marching Powder is an amusing train of thought. But his current standing in the British media is moderately fascinating. Being relentlessly mocked by many regulars in the comedy scene for his performances and Jack the Lad persona, Dyer's defied the fate of many similarly spotlighted celebs by embracing the way he's perceived, occasionally appearing on panel shows and holding his own shoulder to shoulder with many of the comics who poke fun at him, and enjoyed, if not a career renaissance, steady work with an affectionate following at the very least. None of this success was accompanied by a cleaning up of his persona, so to speak. He's as much of an outspoken Cockney man as ever and shows little care for being associated with any stereotypes attached to that label, or being criticised for what comes out of his mouth. And yet, whether his conscience has always steered him this way, or his position as a media figure has swayed him in this direction, he rises above being a dismissible stereotype by demonstrating a decent amount of class consciousness. Not so much that you should expect him to declare himself a Marxist anytime soon, but enough that if he spoke in RP, he'd certainly be labelled one by the right-wing pundits. It's enough of a divergence of traits to make Marching Powder an interesting, if occasionally squirm-inducing, viewing experience, regardless of whether Dyer's character Jack, a cocaine-snorting football hooligan on probation, is semi-autobiographical or just made with him in mind. On the one hand, it asserts itself as non-PC from the opening scene and wears that label with all the eye-roll-worthy pride of a visit to your granddad's local social club. On the other hand, the opposition it takes to modern attitudes is never presented as a conservative-esque rejection of progressive attitudes. Jack is corrected when failing to use up-to-date terminology, but acquiesces when corrected. He and his wife Danny are perplexed by the new waviness of a group therapy session, but push forward with the communicative advice they are given in order to improve their marriage. And crucially, an encounter with a bunch of young hipsters who Jack's colleague labels snowflakes escalates to violence when one of the hipsters presumptuously addresses said colleague using a racial slur, as if it's some affectionate greeting. A common factor with the people who draw Jack's ire is classism. They present themselves as morally and intellectually superior, but never work to prove themselves as such. The latest model of middle to upper class snobbery that seeks to remind Jack at every opportunity of how redundant a human being he is. A reminder that only spurs on Jack's self-destructive behaviour. And how uncompromising Marching Powder is with depicting Jack's actions as self-sabotaging is another surprising turn for a film that, at first glance, looks as though it might settle for glorifying rather than confronting its lead, pointing the finger at someone else for any tragedies that may befall him. It's never fully committed to actually dealing with the prospect of long-term consequences that may come from his negligent indulgence or violence. It settles for a somewhat Catholic approach to believing that earnest confession of one's sins is suitable enough to merit absolution. Jack admits openly to his failings and even sees a path to overcoming his problems, but is still too set in his ways to readily walk that path. It's a role that's more meditative and thoughtful than many might instinctively expect from Dyer, but at the same time, one that's custom-made for him in the crossroads of life he finds himself in, as far as I understand it from my limited exposure to him. I don't often like to contribute to the "we don't get these kinds of mid-budget buddy hijinks comedies anymore" conversation because it feels like an over-exaggeration. But I checked. I haven't seen one of these in a year and a half. I'm sure there's a dozen a month released on Netflix. Streaming's pretty much cornered the market on comedies, presumably because audiences are constantly bombarded with the implication that nothing less than a blockbuster of epic proportion merits an excursion to the cinema. It's a disheartening assumption, not just because it's a loss for cinemas, but because it labels rom-coms, buddy comedies, and so on as a passive genre. The sort of thing that's not worth getting up for or giving your full attention to as it plays on your TV. Is it any wonder that even picking out a film from that conveyor belt of a menu feels like such a chore, and the productions themselves feel so listless? One of them days is a buddy comedy where two best friends try to avoid getting evicted at the end of the day, and it feels like it was made for the cinema. I credit that partly to the theatrical experience itself, but the film is a ball of energy that never lets up. Much of which is owed not just to the pairing of Keke Palmer, in her first lead role since her star-making turn in Nope, and SZA, in her acting debut, but how the casting flips the expected odd couple pairing. With Palmer's electric charisma and SZA's dreamy, relaxed demeanour, you'd expect the former to be the wild card and the latter to be the straight man. But SZA's Alyssa being unreliable because of how carefree she tries to be is a refreshing take that also allows Palmer, in the role of Drew, to show that she doesn't need to ramp it up to 11 or even be the comic foil to be a scene stealer. Brought together, Alyssa and Drew keep the mood breezy yet rambunctious as they hop from one scenario to another trying to recover their lost rent money. It's a hard ask of a comedy to keep up that sort of tone when the underlying theme to the girl's dilemma is so familiarly sad, one of financial strain and gentrification putting greater pressure than ever on ordinary people to live day to day. The story's never about overcoming it, nobody in the film is in any position to do that. It's merely about surviving it and possibly learning how to make it work for you. But One of Those Days manages it with such a plum that it reminds you of the value of comedies like this once being a cinematic staple. It never ignores the very real injustice and hardship that informs the struggle of the central characters, but it helps you to take a deep breath and appreciate the very full lives of the people caught up in such concerns who refuse to allow it to break them. It's a therapeutic type of escapism that's best experienced alongside a group of strangers sat in front of as large a screen as possible, united in shared raucous laughter. Our introduction to the leading trio of Last Breath, played by Woody Harrelson, Simu Liu, and Finn Cole, establishing them respectively as the veteran jokester, the emotionally closed off professional, and the green, starry eyed youngster, is not set up for character arcs. The one clear objective of the film, once the divers are stranded at the bottom of the ocean with a freak storm severing them from their lifelines, is get back alive, with the personality archetypes mostly designed to make each of the three feel distinct and to reinforce the camaraderie between them as, despite their differences, they pull together like committed professionals when faced with a life or death scenario. So most of the focus really is on the tension of being submerged in the empty depths of the ocean. The image of a deep sea diving suit illuminated by one light or flare while the rest of the scene is enveloped in pitch black is a decent enough image, but not necessarily the best way to convey the ironic claustrophobia of such emptiness being separated from the cast by such a comparatively narrow barrier. It called to mind the argument to return to the time when night scenes were coloured a deep blue rather than black or grey. Most arguments in favour of that are made in the name of clarity over realism. After all, cinema almost always offers a third-person perspective, and therefore we're never required to see things directly through the eyes of the people we're watching. So opting for realism doesn't directly translate to conveying the sensation of a given scenario. Contradictory as it sounds, there would likely be more to offer by actually being able to see more of how little there was, stretching as far as the eye could see. Willy Wonka Meets Midsummer is the mashup for the latest satirical horror foray into the bizarre lifestyles of the rich and the famous, with Io Adebiri taking on the Charlie Bucket role of Ariel Acton, an aspiring author-journalist unexpectedly invited alongside more established and successful media personalities to a listening party at a recluse musical superstar's remote estate. Eerie cult vibes ensue as the guests start to disappear and the attendants assigned to Ariel and company become increasingly overbearing and invasive. Whatever all the eeriness pertains to is sadly left up in the air for most of the runtime as Opus adopts the plotting of an old-fashioned kind of TV filler episode, where the protagonist becomes increasingly panicked and frustrated by the mystery that nobody else acknowledges until they get the answers in the last 5 minutes. John Malkovich gets to have some fun as the pop legend turned cult leader at the centre of all the weird goings-on, adopting a vague accent and spaced-out zen that pits Alfred Moretti somewhere between Malkovich's more straightforwardly evil villain roles and Pascal Sauvage from Johnny English, a perfect personification of Opus's general tonal indecisiveness. The satirical pretentiousness of celebrity self-importance is caked over every instance of the film, to the point where the belatedly revealed revolutionary ambitions of Moretti and his cult are cast in a pretty confused light. Framing Moretti both as a born-again prophet of extraordinary sway over his followers, and a potential harbinger of a new movement or maybe even new world order, and as a petty, pampered celebrity whose fragile ego reveals the limitations of his proposed sense of enlightenment. The worship he garners supporting the former, and the relationship he has with the first victims of his plans supporting the latter. One clear consensus of Mark Anthony Green's opus, regardless of whether Moretti's ambitions are meant to be seen as those of a frightening genius sure to succeed, or a pitiful brat doomed to fail, is that any revolution that has any chance of taking off in our day and age will only stem from a benefactor of the current system, signifying how we are doomed forever to fall behind egomaniac power figures and suffer under their vision of a perfect world. What Opus feels about any of that on a deeper level, though, is lost in the muddled tone and delayed revelations. Not a lot of love is spared for either the existing status quo or the proposed new regime of Moretti's cult, but whether it interprets the replacement of one with the other a noteworthy change is left up in the air, as the only thing we really learn about their ideology is that they're pretty obsessive and extreme in their commitment to it. The general passiveness of the film's observations are particularly unfair on Ariel, the normal surrounded by the decadence of the celebrity world. Her status as a typically middle-class American is lightly jabbed at, describing her as someone with no insightful perspective of her own to offer the world because she's never truly suffered and therefore never earned it. Whether this analysis is meant to be the motivating factor to why Moretti picked her to be the witness and reporter of his cult's emergence is, again, barely explored. Has the suffering she encountered at Moretti's hands made her a more accessible writer to the masses? Or does her existing status as a not particularly noteworthy journalist simply make her the natural successor to the media personalities she accompanied to Moretti's complex? What audience specifically does Moretti value and want to connect with through Ariel's penmanship? How widespread is the mass ignorance that breeds success for such figureheads? It is sometimes unfair to judge the film you get based on the film you expected or wanted, but in cases like this, it feels justified because these really feel like the satirical points they're aiming to touch on, but meandered about for far too long on easy potshots at the out-of-touch 0.1% and the celebrity they cultivate. When a creative and their body of work undergoes a critical reevaluation, what is it that usually prompts it? Is it due to a maturation of the artist's abilities, resulting in an evolution from their early work to their most recent? Perhaps it's a missing the forest for the trees situation, where an overlooked attribute of the art is finally appreciated by the audience. Or could it be down to the progression of time and the shifting cultural landscape that exists with it, redefining the standards with which we assess any work of art? It's a case-by-case basis, of course. I think it could be argued, for example, that all three apply to the reappraisal of Michael Bay's work. Recent films of his, particularly Ambulance, feel like a real refinement of Bay's kinetic style. But as well as the chaotic maximalism of his entire filmography being acknowledged as enough of a distinct Bay trait to put to rest any accusations of him being a hack, the profound grotesquerie found throughout his work, particularly in Bad Boys 2 and Pain and Gain, has earned him greater acclaim in some circles over the past 10 years or so than perhaps even he's aware of. But plenty of directors have enjoyed this newfound appreciation. Zack Snyder, M. Night Shyamalan, Ed Wood. I'm not sure if Paul W.S. Anderson was ever someone I considered for it. He's not a director whose films I've ever actively avoided. Critical consensus around every new Anderson release always felt more dismissive than contemptible, and the result was that he was simply branded one of the more successful peddlers of an all-too-familiar brand of CG-riddled action schlock that really seemed to dominate the 2000 cinema landscape. And upon seeing a trailer for In the Lost Lands, my gut instinct was to carry on dismissing him as such a peddler of a now obsolete and outdated aesthetic. On the other hand, we've surely moved on from a point where just labelling something dark or CG heavy counts as an actual assessment, right? The shifting cultural landscape option certainly applies to Anderson's works, if not the other two as well. Looking back on the rise of the MCU all those years ago, I was one of many, I think, who heralded its success as the demise of the sci-fi fantasy action films that preceded it. And in hindsight, I'm struggling to think of any argument made in favour of Marvel's approach that actually acknowledged what was new and distinct about it. Rather, most comparisons praising Marvel over its immediate predecessors merely focused on what it wasn't. Flash forward to today's Hollywood, in which not just Marvel but most studio tentpoles feel pretty visually dispassionate. In the Lost Lands really does feel like it adds something that's missing from so many contemporary blockbusters. It's perhaps not as obvious as our yearning for practical stunt work, on-location filming, or shooting on film rather than digital, because plenty of new releases are filled to the brim with digital effects and gloomy imagery after all. But there really is something painterly to Anderson's imagery. The glossy sheen enveloping Mila Jovovich and Dave Bautista in front of the analogous backdrops of the post-apocalyptic city, wastelands, and fire pits all pop in a way that I think we're still not really meant to admit computer-generated imagery is capable of doing. All pop in a way that I think we're still not really meant to admit computer-generated imagery is capable of. There's even a charm to the hastiness Anderson exhibits to tell the whole story adapted from works of George R. R. Martin. There's even a charm to the hastiness Anderson exhibits to tell the whole story, adapted from the works of George R. R. Martin, in a tight 1 hour and 40 minutes, something that has the potential to be traumatically hilarious for anyone still waiting for Martin to finish his book series, or just outright traumatic for anyone still trying to recover from the last time a Martin adaptation got itself in a hurry to reach the ending. But in a funny way, it complements the story, wherein the remaining figureheads of outdated power structures scheme against one another in a desperate bid to seize control of a world more than likely ravaged by the institutions they evoke. The Church and Monarchy's desires all rest on the fate of two outlaws, a witch and a hunter, who, despite being at the heart of the non-stop chase throughout the story, are the least eager to see their quest completed, both bearing the true burdens of living in such an accursed time, isolated and condemned to their ways of life. It lends a level of poignancy and even comedy to the relentlessness of the chase, and even laces the righteous anger of the brimming revolution against all systems of power with a feeling of bitter futility. It's a broodiness that doesn't feel tiresome but genuinely melancholic. All this to say, yeah, I think I finally will check out more of Paul W.S. Anderson's work. The potential influences of Y2K are pretty widespread, the most obvious being comedic riffs on classic sci-fi or end-of-the-world plots, like This Is the End and The World's End, as well as Superbad and other straight-up comedies focused on geeks attending a high school party. It even follows Superbad's lead of being kinda sorta retro, but whereas that's mostly a stylistic hint with Superbad, Y2K actually sets itself, obviously, on New Year's Eve 1999, to entertain a notion that the rumoured Y2K bug would bring about the robot apocalypse. So taking the raunchy high school comedy angle and adding the absurdity found in the Cornetto trilogy and similar films that pair the world-ending stakes with mundane personal quibbles, Y2K should be just naturally pretty raunchy and pretty absurd. And it certainly would be if not for being one of the sleepiest films made in recent memory. The desaturated gloominess of the visuals certainly get this mood across early as we go about the day-to-day of the high school kids gearing up for the New Year's Eve party, most of the actors feeling either uncertain of raising their voices beyond a mumble to convey any enthusiasm, or just not interested in the context of the shrug-worthy lines they have to deliver. But you sit in hope that this is all part of the effort to make the incoming apocalypse really ramp up the excitement. But after the mild amusement of one kid's head being set alight, not a lot of imagination goes into the kills or the killer robots, assembled from every stray piece of household technology to form hulking mechanical bodies. Everything just kind of comes up without being properly processed, so that when the characters return to talking about relationship drama or debating what qualifies as cool music, it's not absurdly funny, it's just matching the aimlessness of the robot uprising. There's a potential attempt to elicit shock when a lot of the characters that got a decent amount of screen time are killed off pretty soon after the ball drops, but it mostly makes you expect the ending to arrive sooner than it does, as you're left with a pretty disparate group of kids, though less in the charmingly dysfunctional way and more in the who are these people way. The last thing Y2K evokes with this fatigued atmosphere is the feeling that we're back in the year 1999, the epicenter of a pop culture era defined by excess. The visual language should feel like an assault on the senses. Even with most of these kids adopting a more grunge-adjacent look and attitude, the grunge era that preceded 1999 and the emo boom that followed it were still brimming with energy. As someone who has absolutely no nostalgic attachment to them whatsoever, even I know that this is not a suitable reflection of the Limp Bizkit boom. Flow finally fulfills the promise of so many trailers for animated films, usually set in an era when dinosaurs roam the earth, of following non-anthropomorphic animals set out on a journey with no human voices attached to more directly communicate their feelings to the audience. I refuse to give in to the hope that they wouldn't reveal that the beautiful first trailer was a misdirect and all the animals of Flow actually talk until I finally saw it for myself. Animated in a sort of indie video game way, with most of the minute detail going into the landscape, the animals are nevertheless very effectively animated to move and behave in a very naturalistic manner. Of course, that has to be taken at face value for most of the animals, unless you've happened to have a capybara, lemur, or secretary bird as a pet. But just about anyone will be familiar with the distinct behavioral tics of the central cat and the various dogs in the film. It reveals the strength of restricting dialogue to more anthropomorphic animal characters, as the human emotion conveyed by the spoken word often shines more when accompanied by body language. The way the animals of Flow interact with each other and their environment is recognizable enough that even when they display more conscious traits such as cooperation, it's far easier to find yourself immersed in their journey without the insertion and interference of exclusively human modes of communication. And the journey does appear at the forefront to be one of cooperation and community. which feels like a pretty appropriate developmental journey to give a cat of all animals. As the nameless feline finds itself stuck aboard a boat when the world, seemingly abandoned by humans, their homes, trinkets, and animal statues being all they left behind, experiences a flash flood of biblical proportions. Joined by a group of animals that come aboard along the way, the boat sails towards a point on the horizon, perhaps because it's the only evidence of land available to their eyes, or perhaps for a deeper spiritual reason. However deep you wish to delve into the subtext of Flo's journey, the core survival adventure is effortlessly easy to invest in, both for the natural protectiveness that the vast majority of us feel towards animals, especially those that we keep as pets, and for the way that their muted expressions reveal the expansive nature of the visual language. Ever since it was first advertised, I've been so curious why a working man, a Jason Statham starring, Taken-esque action film in which he plays a retired soldier brought out of retirement when someone he cares about is threatened by a criminal gang, directed by David Ayer no less, wasn't just a Beekeeper sequel. Turns out that's in development too, as it should be given how well it did. A Working Man is just a very similar collaboration between the same director and star, this time based on a novel from 2014. And the writing does appear to be the key difference. The Beekeeper script from the writer-director of Equilibrium and Ultraviolet, Kurt Wimmer, tells the story of Adam Clay, a former member of a specially trained group of assassins that operates separate from and above any US government organization, seeking revenge against a group of fishing con men for stealing his friend's money and driving her to suicide, killing his way up the corporate ladder to expose and wreak havoc on the multi-million-dollar tech companies and government affiliates connected to and financing all the lower-level scam artists. It's about as seething a takedown of America's vicious wealth inequality and its perpetrators as an unabashedly silly revenge thriller can be, and a pleasant change from the genre's often more xenophobic focus on international criminal gangs and terror plots. A Working Man, co-written by Ayer and Sylvester Stallone, fittingly takes on a Rambo-adjacent premise, with Statham's Levon Cade, an ex-Royal Marine turned construction worker, whose years of dutiful service has not earned him a penny to his name, living out of his car while trying to hold on to the minimal time he gets to spend with his daughter. Minor criticism of Britain's, and presumably America's if Cade's dual citizenship has any bearing on this, treatment towards its veterans does not extend to military procedure. The fun experimental assassinations of the Beekeeper are exchanged for brutal torture and quick headshot kills, just like the American villains hiding from justice by claiming legitimacy, are replaced for egomaniac drug dealers and sex traffickers working for Russian mobsters with feudalist honor codes. With Ayer opting for a darker, shakier filming style than he did for the Beekeeper, it's clear that this kind of framing of heroes and villains is supposed to be interpreted as the harsher, more brutally realistic of the two, despite the fact that, truthfully, it paints a much more uncomplicated picture that allows for simpler, unquestionable framing of who or what is the corrupting evil in the world that must be exterminated. Add to that these villains lack the complacency and indoctrinated sense of superiority that made the Beekeeper villains so fun to hate. If you were to ask a Working Man villain why they did the horrible things they do, they'd most likely respond with, "I'm Russian, it's what we do," which goes some way to explaining why the fights and the kills feel as detached as they do. Adam Clay killed the people he was chasing in unique, complicated ways because he had a fundamental reason beyond the personal to find these guys despicable. And from there sprung the fun of the whole film. I eagerly await The Beekeeper 2. It's hard to say if Black Bag is a relationship drama masquerading as a spy thriller in exactly the same way that Presence is a family drama in the guise of a ghost story. Presence, as well as flipping the perspective of the typical haunted house horror for a unique insight, weaves the titular presence so indelibly into the foundations of the film that if you removed it, the story and the family at its heart would not be the same. Black Bag's espionage plot, on the other hand, is pretty classic. A traitor is in our midst, a mole hunt commences, everyone's a suspect, global security is at risk, everything you once had faith in may be irreparably shattered. And the frank, cutting, and tense dialogues that so eloquently shape the ensemble cast into one of the most magnetic group of characters seen on the big or small screen in recent years could be just as easily written into a more mundane-seeming career path. Real estate is nowhere near as thrilling a working environment as the Secret Service, but that doesn't hinder Glenn Ross's characters from treating their jobs like a specialist life or death field that dominates every aspect of their lives. And yet, thanks to the glee that you can feel from David Koepp's script and Steven Soderbergh's economic yet playful direction, never expected a shot of a cake being wrapped in cling film to be the thing that would make me laugh the hardest in a cinema all year. Nesting the dysfunctional romantic and sexual web of six colleagues within a cat and mouse game of intrigue feels like the only choice they could have ever made. At first teasing us with the notion that all the secrecy, backstabbing, and suspicion within these people's love lives is a byproduct of their being suited to a career of secrecy and deception, before making it uncomfortably, hilariously clear that their hang-ups are so human on such a fundamentally unspecial and rather pitiful level. Doubly so when you consider that these guys are probably still painted in a more flattering and competent light than the people who actually do this kind of work in the real world. That such a delectable web of interpersonal drama is accomplished in a tight 90 minutes also serves as an invaluable reminder in this age of TV shows that are really a movie split into 10-hour-long installments, that how many hours you get is far less important than what you do with the time you have. Koepp's script sizzles in Soderbergh's spacious, moody dining rooms and sterile office spaces, with some of the most measured but emotionally brimming performances from, apologies, but every main player in this deserves a shout out, the wounded and guarded Michael Fassbender, the stoical and cocksure Regé-Jean Page, the controlling yet vulnerable Naomi Harris, the outwardly self-assured Tom Burke failing to mask his fears and depression, the fresh-faced and excitable but naturally cynical Marisa Abela, and of course Cate Blanchett exercising her usual, natural-feeling, quiet cool as the front for a character so steeped in the paranoia and uncertainty of the life she's chosen that her only way to maintain her grasp on any sense of reality and stability is to put such a monumental, potentially even deluded amount of faith in the constants of her life that she is deemed trustworthy. And even in his brief appearance in a couple of scenes, the image of Pierce Brosnan playing the seasoned boss who staunchly refuses to give away a shred of emotion he doesn't freely offer himself, succumbing to an involuntary twitch the moment he realizes he's been outplayed, is one I won't soon forget. For all the sumptuous dialogue the actors are handed, the silent spaces in between speak even greater volumes, a truth that also shapes both the spycraft and the relationships of Black Bag. Where others paint every musical, horror, or action movie with the same brush, I struggle eternally with distinguishing one period mafia crime drama from another. Oh, one of the gangsters is a deranged meathead who brutally kills people for the pettiest reasons. Well, colour me shocked, who knows where it's going to go next. It's frustrating, of course, especially as this is a genre that gets a lot of critics and film buffs salivating, and I always yearn to find something unique about any film I see, regardless of how familiar the tropes are. But for as dark and complicated as these power figures of the American underworld always are, I just can't help but feel that our preoccupation with these insecure schemers lifting one another up as distinguished businessmen of a vast criminal empire is more escapist than it is a rich portrait of the dark side of humanity. And there's nothing wrong with escapism, it can be just as revealing and rich in detail, so long as we're open to what part of the brain it clicks with. The unique detail in this tussle for power between two old friends turned mob rivals is that the adversaries are both played by Robert De Niro, allowing him to inhabit the classic roles of the guy who wants out and the power-mad psychopath. You can certainly see De Niro giving it his all to really distinguish one from the other, particularly in the way he moves. Not a lot is really made, though, of Frank and Vito's history as best friends turned enemies, as they only occupy the screen at the same time in a couple of scenes, something that might have given more weight and drawn more attention to the image of two major characters sharing the same face. Missing as well is the sizzling dialogue that racked up the tension in films like Goodfellas, with Vito in particular clearly inspired by Joe Pesci's performance in that film. It's unclear if the actors were left to riff with one another in their cliche forget about it spiel, or if the scriptwriter just didn't know how to move the drama through mundane and casual conversation. But a lot of what the characters say feels very disassociated from the story. The story culminates with basically all the characters having refused to change throughout, several of them dying empty deaths, having learned nothing, secure in the feeling that they were in the right to their last breath. It's a gangster film, alright. On the surface, Novocaine's approach to action comedy appears to be one of intentional dissonance. marrying the sweetest of rom-com setups with the most egregious scenes of bodily harm, not dissimilar from what Love Hurts seemed to be going for the month before. It's more self-conscious about the absurd dissonance, however, with Jack Quaid's Nathan Kane, a mostly ordinary assistant bank manager, very aware that even with his rare condition that makes him unable to feel pain, he is thoroughly unprepared and unsuited to save his crush, Sherry, played by Amber Midthunder, from the unhinged robbers that took her hostage. As apprehensive as it is to fully lose itself in the story, however, it's also a lot more confident in its general scene-to-scene progression than Love Hurts. And everything from the setup of Nathan as a reluctantly antisocial guy forced to take extreme care with everything he does, to his impulsive decision to go full vigilante to save the first person he's met who successfully convinced him to come out of his shell and try enjoying his life to the full, is well considered and feels pretty natural. There's enough graphic injury detail coming out of each fight scene to be sure that the filmmakers definitely get the fun potential that a gimmick like this offers up. But the gory injuries are mostly reserved for quick insert shots. When it comes to the fights, traps, and torture scenarios Nathan finds himself in, the apprehension shows its face again, in the form of the action and the comedy both being held back, presumably out of concern for one overwhelming the other, but the result being that no scene really makes either an especially exciting nor amusing impression. This also means that the twists and development of the kidnapping and romance plot don't push Nathan's character as far as he potentially could be pushed. While he's never framed as an especially intense or troubled shut-in, much like in Companion, Jack Quaid's definitely been cast to lend a level of quiet, adorable charm to the role, he is nevertheless someone who has grown up to believe that any real pleasure in his life could be deadly, and a strict regiment has to be maintained 24/7 until a beautiful, lovable woman approaches him and inspires him to embrace life. One date later, she's kidnapped, and he dives headfirst into every deadly situation in front of him to save her, all of which are padded with plenty of "this is crazy" remarks, but still no hesitation really involved. Now, there are plenty of cases of manic pixie dream girl stories, and arguably almost as many critiques of the trope in which the girl in question points out very clearly that they are their own person with their own things going on. And Sherry is ultimately the latter. Amber Midthunder thankfully gets more to do than just the typical MBDG shtick, but Novocaine really had the opportunity to push the inadvisability of putting such unrealistic expectations on someone you know nothing about, by being utterly unrelenting with the amount of visible harm he causes himself in such an ill-advised pursuit. Not only giving license to be as repulsively cruel in the action as the imagination can allow, but providing a unique, dark comedic take on the pitfalls of mistaking obsession for love. Instead, the half-measured approach mostly makes Novocaine feel like a rom-com that ended in the first 20 minutes, that got interrupted by an action film before the final kiss could happen. Reflecting on Snow White's significance in the Disney canon, knowing what I know of the back-breaking work that went into its production, an undertaking unlike any other at the time, spanning years of work and staking the company's entire future on its success, all part of an endeavor to create something unprecedented, made it a sad affair to see it become the latest remake on the Disney Studios conveyor belt. It was sadder still to see how the few glimpses of the film offered from the half-hearted marketing campaign framed it as one of the hastiest and most half-baked productions in the oeuvre of Disney live-action remakes yet. And to top it all off, it seems that anyone at the studio responsible for the seeming lackluster results of Disney's Snow White are more than content to hide from criticism by fanning the flames of the publicity surrounding the film's star, Rachel Zegler, leaving her to bear the brunt of the increasingly venomous hate campaigns leveled against her for being simply cast in the lead role. None of this puts you in an ideal mood to sit down and watch a film. No matter how pervasive certain flaws can be in various major studio productions, be they Marvel, Star Wars, Disney, or whatever else, it doesn't do anyone any good to dismiss everything from them as being completely interchangeable. Lazy criticism doesn't improve lazy filmmaking. But the increased gloom surrounding Snow White made it especially difficult to hope that something would stand out, which made it all the more pleasant to actually find multiple redeeming traits within. For starters, for all the initial negative press leveled against Zegler for quotes about the Snow White character, completely overblown again, given that "this isn't your grandma's Disney film" is the marketing strategy for all these remakes, the remake isn't all that interested in subverting the character or story. Part of this is likely motivated by the fact that we've already had a semi-recent Snow White that cast the lead in a warrior princess light. But the inevitable expansion of the 1937 film's premise to give Snow White more agency in the climax and center the evil queen's defeat around liberating the kingdom from her evil grasp incorporates the kind and healing nature of the protagonist as the main motivation behind inciting rebellion. And while there are obvious pitfalls to be found in a story trying to be about redistributing the wealth to the common man that still frames a better monarch as the leader of the revolution, not to mention this film coming from a billionaire CEO of a trillion-dollar studio, there are nice touches to be found in the messaging, such as finding empathy for those who find themselves turning to criminal means because the kingdom they live under has taken all their possessions from them, the ruling class belittling their subjects' needs as greed and theft, and offsetting the seeming naivety of a bloodless rebellion succeeding by centering Snow White's victory in winning over the Queen's main source of defense and authority, her army, to oppose her. Equally unexpected was the golden sheen that colors most of the film, particularly outside the kingdom in the forest and the home of the Seven Dwarfs. It's a far cry from the dreary grey colorization and backlit lighting of so many films like it, rendering most frames dull at best and incomprehensible at worst. By these standards, Snow White is a fairly pretty film to look at. By a lot of other standards, it's still pretty lacking, though most likely an unfair comparison, a recent rewatch of the Lord of the Rings trilogy left me in awe of how two equally gorgeously designed elvish set pieces, Rivendell and Lothlorien, are framed entirely differently, the former as warm and inviting, and the latter as cold and lonesome, not as a way of reflecting the nature of the locations, but as a way of representing the emotional state of the characters in each point of the story. Regardless of whatever situation the characters find themselves in Snow White, the cinematography offers little to no change. A pleasant exception is the recreation of Snow White's escape from the kingdom, which aims for its own spooky surrealism as an homage to the same scene from the 37 film. The CG effects are mostly a pleasant surprise as well. Whether or not it's in response to criticisms of the 2019 Lion King, the woodland animals get to be vibrant and expressive. A more mixed result is the animation of the dwarves, although that's not really due to how they're designed. After the initial shock of their first reveal as Polar Express reminiscent mocaps has diminished, their designs aren't all that alienating. The problem is more down to why they're animated. CG has always felt like its own innovative art form or tool when it's applied to make something that only CG can create, i.e. animals mugging and moving in ways you just can't get real ones to. Replacing something that exists in the real world comes off as cynical, and that's especially the case when the things you're replacing are real people. The argument could be made that they wanted the dwarfs to be the most animated part of the live-action film, and they are designed to look somewhat like their animated counterparts, but they're also designed to be as naturalistic and uncanny in skin texture and body movement as possible within those parameters. So the looniness of their antics is greatly diminished anyway, and all the cuts to any references to their being dwarfs, not to mention an implication that they're centuries-old supernatural creatures, only makes the controversy around Disney's decision not to cast suitable actors in the roles all the more glaring. The music from the Greatest Showman duo is nice enough. Their reimaginings of Hi Ho and The Silly Song are the highlights, though. The Queen's number presents an issue with her character, however, that goes beyond the fact that she's obviously miscast, which is that there seems to be a tug-of-war going on between evoking the dry, steely camp of the animated Evil Queen and infusing her with more loudly expressive and foppish mannerisms found in villains like Cruella and Ursula, which largely neuters most of the scarier scenes involving her and again scuppers the chance for more variety and atmosphere. The absolute best trait of the film, however, is Rachel Zegler, the best casting choice in the whole film, which is doubly relieving given that the protagonist really should be the character you want to get right first and foremost. She tracks a delicate path of repression, anxiety, liberation, newfound strength, empathetic love, and righteous anger that makes her Snow White both reminiscent of the original and its own beast. It means that even as the third act's recontextualization of her journey and relationship to the villain starts to render the story rather clunky, the character progression is something that you can easily go along with and develop an emotional attachment to. It's the reason that, while I don't think I'll ever be compelled to tell someone to watch a live-action remake instead of an animated original, I'd feel assured that any kid who saw this Snow White first still got something good out of the experience.